Hello, community group friends, and welcome back for the third of 3 lessons on the parables of the kingdom and of 9 lessons total on the parables of Jesus in general. We're generally following the commentary on these parables written by Robert Farrar Capon. Today we will be considering the final 2 of the 5 attributes of the parables of the kingdom, hostility and response. We're going to look at the parable of the wheat and tares, which is a type of weed, that our friend Matthew records for us in chapter 13 of his book. Interestingly, like the parable of the seeds, this is a parable that Jesus explains to his disciples later in the chapter. We've already talked about mystery, Lesson 1, and actuality and catholicity, Lesson 2. If you were not here for one of those, I recommend you take the time to go back to the film clips and listen to them. But today, as I said, we're going to discuss the attributes of the kingdom that Capon makes clear, hostility and response. Here are some questions to bear in mind as we hear Matthew quote Jesus telling these parables. In the parable of wheat and tares, where do you see mystery, catholicity, actuality? Is the purpose of the parable to merely describe a situation about which Jesus wanted to make his disciples aware, or is there a prescription here? In other words, some direction for how they should live their lives. That perhaps applies to us as well.
Thanks for having me back, community group. I've come to look forward to these meetings. To start our discussion, let me read from my book, the 13th chapter, starting at verse 24. Jesus told us this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Many of us disciples were fishermen. I was a tax collector, and others among the disciples were from other professions. But all of us realized farmers don't let weeds grow until harvest time. We wondered what Jesus was thinking with this rather silly story.
Thanks, Matthew. I know you know the answer to your question at this point, but I'll take over here to start drawing out that answer with our group. Let's start with a kind of review. Where in the parable of the wheat and the tares do you see mystery, actuality, and catholicity? And as a reminder of what each of these things mean, I'll put this slide up. Next, what are the attributes of the hostility to the kingdom as portrayed in the parable? Do we see the open hostility of the birds, rocky ground or thorns, that we saw in the parable of the sower? What element of this parable emphasizes this difference? I'm going to quote Capon here for a few slides and ask you at the end whether you agree with him or not. The enemy, says Capon, has no power against goodness in and of itself. The wheat is in the field, the kingdom is in the world, and there is not a thing the devil can do about any of it. But, following the parable, the enemy turns out not to need anything more than negative power. He had to act only minimally on his own to wreak havoc in the world. Mostly he depends on the forces of goodness, insofar as he can succor them into taking up arms against the confusion he has introduced to do his work. That is precisely why the enemy goes away after sowing the weeds. He has no need whatsoever to hang around. Goodness itself, in other words, if it is sufficiently committed to plausible, right-handed, strong-arm methods, will, in the very name of goodness, do all and more than all that evil ever had in mind. Do you agree with Capon here? Capon then points to this final, quietly dramatic verse near the close of his first telling of the parable to sustain his point. Do you agree with Capon? Can you think of historical examples that suggest Capon is right and others that suggest he is wrong? As an example, Capon cites the fact that even today Muslims are sensitive about the Crusades, when, between 1096 and 1271 AD, soldiers from Christian nations were dispatched to the Middle East with the objective of recovering the Holy Land from Islamic rule. Today, some cite the historical fact of well-meaning missionaries in India feeding the poor in the early part of the 20th century, thereby creating a stigma about Christianity surviving today that it is the religion for the poor only. Indeed, it is very difficult in contemporary India to convince an upper-class influential Indian, or even a middle-class person, to consider the claims of Jesus, often based on this bias. Some say that politicization of church has too often positioned Christianity in a social setting and in a way with which Jesus might be disappointed. Some Christians ask whether, when we go on short-term mission trips to do work like construction or the painting of a building, are we keeping local builders and painters from getting that business? Are we thereby adding harm to the good we do? So what do you think? Crusades? Feeding the poor in India? Voicing Christian views in the public square? Going on short-term mission trips? Are these really as effective in their intended purpose as those involved have imagined? Let's take a close look at what Jesus said as told through his parable. Let's look at the word translated let in the parable, where the context is let both, meaning the wheat and the weeds, grow together. This word is numbered 863 in Strong's Concordance. We explained what this reference is in the last session. When we look up word number 863, we see the following. We see that this word has many different shades of meaning, and while the number of times it is translated leave or let is 52 times, it is also translated forgive 47 times. So is the sense of Jesus' instructions regarding the disposition of the weeds as the servants in the parable expected, due to just nonchalance on Jesus' part, or was there also a sense of forgiveness? But that idea won't always go over well in Christian circles, where we continue to think in right-handed power terms. Think about this. From God's perspective, what is the difference between forgiveness and permission? Does the difference between these two imply the passage of time? Does God experience time as we do? But Jesus does tell us through the parable that there are eventual consequences for sin in the kingdom. Think about this. The devil and his work, let's call it modnik, for kingdom spelled backward, is able to tolerate mystery, actuality, and Catholicity, and of course perpetuates hostility toward the kingdom. But, and this is the key, its response is to take advantage of any forgiveness offered it. Some of the examples I used before were ones that may be debatable as to whether they really constitute actions against which this parable warns. But can you think of things Christians do and or have done that really are clearly non-kingdom acts meant to uproot evil in their midst? Do you agree with Capon's characterization here? Is the forgiveness or permission in this parable merely a description of how the kingdom works, or is there a prescription here for kingdom people? Let's look at this another way. During the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught his followers what we now call the Lord's Prayer. Is the forgiveness described in the Lord's Prayer different from the forgiveness portrayed in the parable different? As shown in the blue boxes, the word is the same, number 863, but context does matter. What do you think? That is the end of the presentation. But I'd like to try something a little different this week. Rather than running through the same presentation during our time together, I'd like to let you direct more of what we discuss. So how about this? I have listed the unanswered questions raised through this presentation. I did not take the time to thoroughly, or in some cases even in condensed form, address them. So pick which you'd like to discuss and be ready to help direct the discussion when we meet, okay? What follows are the questions I've raised. Where do you see mystery, actuality, and Catholicity in the parable of the weeds and wheat? Where is hostility in the parable of the weeds and wheat? Is there hostility in the first parable of the four soils? Is hostility portrayed in the same way or differently in the two parables? Do you agree with Capon that goodness itself, if it is sufficiently committed to plausible, right-handed, strong-arm methods, will in the very name of goodness do all and more than all that evil ever had in mind? Can you think of historical examples that suggest Capon is right and others that suggest he is wrong? From God's perspective, what is the difference between forgiveness and permission? Capon says, having no real power, the devil has relied on the misguided goodness of kingdom people to do his work after he leaves the scene. Do you agree with him? Why or why not? Is the forgiveness described in the Lord's Prayer different from the forgiveness portrayed in the parable? As shown, the word is the same, but context matters. What do you think? We didn't get to it, but as mentioned at the beginning, Jesus explains this parable to his disciples. Read Matthew 13:36-43. Capon calls this a flat-footed allegorical explanation, which reveals Jesus' frustration. What in the text suggests Capon might be right, that Jesus was pointing to something beyond his simple explanation? I have distributed the transcript of the Ask Pastor John episode, where John Piper said that the essence of evil is not harm done to man, but indignities done to God. This question is not directly part of the lesson as distributed in the clip, but ultimately the subject parable is about evil, isn't it? So another avenue of discussion is this, and the article of which this quote is a part. Finally, if we are really feeling ambitious, we could also discuss the fundamental problem of evil. Why does it exist? The larger subject of which all these others are parts. I've distributed an article about this fundamental problem taken from a Bible dictionary, along with marginal notes I've added to, hopefully, help explain. If we choose to tackle this, we, of course, will not resolve it. The question has been around for centuries, and it could consume a lot of time, but I'm game if you are. Well, that's it for this lesson. Come to the meeting prepared to vote for 2 or 3 questions you want to discuss, okay?